If just a few short years ago anyone suggested the world economy would no longer need Russia and its resources, they would probably be ridiculed. Yet in 2024, a historic global shift has taken place, rendering this laughter nothing but a whisper of the past. But let's be honest, few people would have predicted such a massive change in such a short time. After all, it was only 2021 when a staggering 83% of Russian gas was being exported to Europe. Dozens of countries were at least 50% dependent on this gas, including Germany, Finland, Greece, and Austria. At that same time, countries like Japan and China were among Russia's top consumers of liquefied natural gas, LNG. That's why Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, believed that he could hold the global economy hostage following the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, using Russian commodity exports as a bargaining chip. But it seems like Putin's economic gambits can be added to the increasingly long list of miscalculations the Russian president has made since invading Ukraine, right up there with underestimating the people of Ukraine. Though the world economy is certainly not at its peak, it hasn't succumbed to Putin's stranglehold, leading to an unexpected yet obvious conclusion. It no longer needs Russia. How is this possible? Given how dependent the global supply chains were on Russian products, how did the West manage to beat Putin on this second war front he established, the energy war? Well, it turns out the joint strength and solidarity of the West was another aspect Putin miscalculated. Of course, the efforts to find alternative sources of energy and establish collaborative initiatives were aided by an unseasonably warm 2022 winter, which lowered the overall demand for energy in the following months and years. Seems like Mother Nature is an unwitting ally in the West's response to Putin's miscalculated energy strategy. Let's see what this response has entailed in more detail. To do this, we must first define the areas where the world economy has been the most dependent on Russian exports. Sure, gas is undoubtedly number one, but we shouldn't minimize the critical role Russian oil, metal, and agriculture have played in global trade. Still, number one is number one. So let's start by examining how the West found a way to mitigate the world's reliance on Russian gas. As already mentioned, this reliance was quite pervasive, with Europe relying on Russia for about 50% of its total gas supply. It's no wonder Russia exported roughly 200 billion cubic meters of natural gas annually, accounting for half of the country's federal revenue. These figures gave Putin the confidence to cut off gas supplies to Europe indefinitely in September 2022. Though the Kremlin claimed this move was a response to the West's punitive economic sanctions, a more sinister agenda soon became apparent. Putin's goal was for Europeans to freeze in cold homes, forcing them to turn on their leaders and demand them to cease support for Ukraine. But that's far from what actually happened. Though Europe was presented with a terrible choice, give in to Putin's whims or let people freeze to death, it came up with a third option rather quickly. This option was to secure alternative gas supplies for its energy needs. However, this option is only one of 3 steps the European Commission made to weaken the grip Russia had on its economy. Step number 1, demanding gas reduction. This step was initiated long before Russia cut off gas supplies, as the country was already seen as an unreliable supplier. With this move, Europe was able to create a joint storage and fill it to as much as 82%. Step 2 is where the alternative gas sources came into play. The goal was clear: diversify away from Russian fossil fuels. Besides natural gas, this also included finding alternative sources of oil and coal, as we'll discuss later. But what did it take to replace Russian gas? There are primarily 2 answers to this question: 1, turning to liquefied natural gas, and 2, seeking more reliable suppliers for piped gas. Europe managed to do both, with the US supplying an estimated 55 billion cubic meters of liquefied natural gas to Europe, and Norway overtaking Russia as the European Union's biggest piped gas supplier. Paired with increases in supply from renewable sources, which was step 3, proposed by the European Commission, Europe has managed to reduce its dependence on Russian gas to an impressive 9%. This alone marked a pivotal stride toward energy autonomy, forging a new chapter in the history of the world economy. As already mentioned, a warm winter also came to Europe's rescue. Thanks to this, Europe managed to accomplish 2 things: avoid the worst-case scenario of letting its residents freeze, and accumulate the gas in its storage tanks. For instance, German storage tanks were only 54% full at the beginning of 2022, but reached a record high of 91% in 2023. With many countries following in Germany's footsteps, it's clear Europe has assured significant energy supply to sustain itself while making alternative energy sources fully operational. The ultimate goal is to completely switch to LNG by raising its export capacity to over 200 billion cubic meters. If you remember, 200 billion cubic meters of natural gas is how much Russia trades yearly, meaning this move could replace the country's exports and eliminate Russia's seat at the world economy table once and for all. But why LNG? And where is all this LNG coming from? Let's start with the why. Unlike piped gas, liquid natural gas doesn't require pipelines for transport. Instead, the gas is transformed into liquid using a process called liquefaction, transported on ocean tankers and then converted back to gas at its final destination. This technology is still relatively new, with even the US, the world's largest LNG exporter, using it in full effect for the first time in 2016. As far as quantities go, global LNG markets are growing rapidly to accommodate the new demand. However, it should be noted that a major factor in providing enough LNG for Europe is that China, the world's largest LNG importer, is gradually turning to domestic sources instead of global ones. Pair this with the lower overall demand for LNG due to existing supplies, and you'll understand why the world economy is expected to make a full recovery after such a tumultuous period. Okay, so we covered the gas issue, but what about oil? Russia is one of the world's largest oil exporters, delivering as many as 9 million barrels per day at its peak. In 2021, this figure was about 7.9 million per day, which is still a major contribution to the global oil market. Shortly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, oil prices skyrocketed by almost 20% as the US and Europe considered a ban on the country's imports. Eventually, the G7 summit opted to implement oil price caps in an effort to limit Russia's earnings from one of its most profitable commodities. Putin responded by announcing a ban on crude oil sales to countries participating in these price caps, starting on February 1, 2023. Now, you might think that this caused oil prices to spike once again. At least Putin was certainly counting on it. But again, the complete opposite happened. The prices went down. This made one thing abundantly clear. The world no longer needed Russian oil. But how is that possible? Well, it's pretty much the same as with the gas. Alternative sources keep popping out, producing enough oil to replace any lost Russian oil seamlessly. In the second half of 2022 alone, countries like the US, Canada, Brazil, and Venezuela truly stepped up, producing 4 million barrels a day in total. Even better, the price of this oil is even lower than before the war, making Putin's attempts to influence oil prices futile. Even Putin seemingly got the message, as Russian Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak announced that the government was ready to cut daily oil output by 700,000 barrels in December 2022. However, it's not all good news in this department. Though Saudi Arabia, the largest oil producer in the world, was supposed to be a US ally, the country has seemingly partnered with Russia to manipulate the price of oil. These two countries have acted together in the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries Plus, OPEC Plus, to lower their oil production, thus causing a shortage in the global market. But this devious game quickly came to a screeching halt. The West has once again united and subjected OPEC Plus's major unused capacity to intense scrutiny, preventing Saudi Arabia from coming to Russia's rescue time after time. Saudi Arabia isn't the only ally that has seemingly turned its back on Russia, so did Turkey, essentially destroying another of Putin's gambits to control the world economy, agriculture. Putin tried to weaponize food supplies, or grain to be precise, by holding Ukrainian supplies hostage and even shelling the agricultural infrastructure in the country. However, Turkey managed to broker a deal, which resulted in opening Ukrainian ports back up following a lengthy blockade. Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Turkey's president, achieved this by promising to allow Russia to export more food supplies and commodities through the Black Sea grain corridor. This just leaves us with metal. Russia has historically dominated several metal markets, including nickel, titanium, and palladium. Fearing that Putin would try to weaponize metal too, many buyers started to look for alternative sources of these valuable metals. The US, for instance, opted to restore its dormant strategic reserves of key metals, aiming to mitigate potential disruptions in the supply chain. Throw new mining projects in South America and Africa into the mix, and it becomes clear that even the Russian metal supply can be replaced permanently in a few years. Major moves have already been made in the cobalt and nickel markets, which should add sufficient supply to offset any potential disruption in the following year or two. So where does all this leave Russia? With zero remaining leverage in the world economy, it appears, all these powerful moves by Western nations taught Putin a valuable lesson. It's much easier for buyers to replace an unreliable supplier than it is for suppliers to reach new markets. Even if Russia manages to secure new buyers for its gas, the diminished demand and altered market dynamics mean these potential customers are unlikely to match the lucrative deals that European countries once provided. This translates to a substantial financial blow for Russia. Things look pretty much the same in the oil department. Though Russia has managed to secure a mighty pool of buyers in the East, led by China and India, The country's flagship oil is now selling at half the global price. Why? Russia's oil buyers might not participate in the G7 oil price caps explicitly, but they sure have used those caps to their advantage. For instance, India is buying more than 30 times more Russian oil than the previous year, but it's doing so with the discounts of up to 50%. Since Russia doesn't really have a choice in the matter, it's hardly making any profit. With this in mind, it shouldn't be surprising that the Kremlin's economic reports have become progressively more selective. Pre-war, all the foreign trade data was updated monthly, including the following: oil and gas production levels, commodity export quantities, capital inflows and outflows, financial reports from prominent companies, foreign direct investment data. Now these reports are either withheld or published incompletely, with all the unfavorable metrics omitted. This has spread throughout the Russian government, with even the country's Federal Agency for Air Transport, Rosaviatsa, no longer publishing data on airport passenger volumes. These desperate moves can only mean one thing: all the international sanctions and joint efforts have paid off, and the Russian economy is deteriorating. And it's deteriorating quickly. So, is that it? Has Russia's economic leverage irreversibly crumbled? If you ask Putin, the answer will be a resounding no. Never one to admit defeat, Russia's president keeps peddling the same old talking points, hoping to maintain a facade of resilience. But let's humor Putin for a second. Let's examine his talking points one by one to determine whether they indicate that Russia won't let go of its grasp on global influence anytime soon, or they are nothing more than desperate myths by a desperate man. First up, one of Putin's favorite talking points, the so-called pivot to the east. Essentially, Putin is claiming that Russia can prosper by redirecting its gas exports to Asia instead of Western nations. But the truth is, this simply isn't feasible, at least for a few more years. The only gas Russia can make a significant profit on is piped gas, as liquefied natural gas makes less than 10% of the country's total gas capacity. And as the name suggests, piped gas needs pipes to be transported. Russia does have a powerful system of fixed pipelines for carrying gas, but most of these pipelines flow toward Europe and through Ukraine, which isn't exactly convenient for the whole pivot to the east shtick. To make matters worse, these pipelines can't be connected to a separate pipeline network linking eastern Siberia to Asia. This means that the only way for Russia to export piped gas to the east is to construct new pipelines. It goes without saying that this is an extremely time-consuming endeavor that poses significant financial and logistical challenges for any country, let alone one at war. Although some projects have already been initiated, it'll take years for them to become operational. That is, if Russia doesn't go bankrupt before. Let's say Russia manages to construct an eastbound pipeline system for argument's sake. Even then, it's improbable the country will be able to export enough gas to match its pre-war European exports. Just compare the 170 billion cubic meters of natural gas sent to Europe to the measly 16.5 billion sent to China, Russia's biggest ally in Asia, and you get the picture. This gap, or should we say canyon, essentially makes any project related to Russia-Asian pipelines a waste of time and money. Even if he decides to proceed with this foolish project, Russia will be long forgotten in the world economy by the time the last pipe is laid. However, this doesn't stop Putin from continuing to praise Asia as some promised land. In his words, the continent is also the perfect market for increased oil sales. And as already mentioned, he is right to some extent. Russia is in fact selling more oil to Asia, but at what cost? And we mean that quite literally. Russian oil has historically been sold at premium prices, with discounts never surpassing $5 per barrel. Well, currently these discounts go up to $35 per barrel, as buyers like China and India drive a hard bargain. Given that Russia has nowhere else to turn, these unprecedented discounts have become a regular occurrence in the Russian oil market. But that's not the only problem in Putin's pivot to the east for oil sales. Like gas, oil has historically been sent to Asia in much smaller quantities than to Europe. Given that it takes approximately 35 days for Russian oil tankers to reach East Asia, this shouldn't come as a surprise, especially considering that the same tankers can reach Europe in as little as 2 days. Given the high cost of transport and low selling prices, it's easy to conclude that Russia is barely breaking even in oil sales, let alone making a significant profit. That's not to mention the high cost of oil production that heavily relies on Western technology. Whichever way you look at it, it's a lose-lose scenario for Russia, but a huge win for countries hoping to do away with Russia on the world economy stage. Again, unsurprisingly, Putin doesn't acknowledge this in any way. Instead, all that comes from Russia are talks of the country's steady finances with hundreds of billions of dollars in rainy day funds. This way, Putin is sending a clear message. Even without gas and oil sales, the Kremlin's finances won't be strained anytime soon. allowing Putin to continue destabilizing the world economy. But is this the truth? Does Putin have enough money to keep Russia forcibly entrenched in global affairs? Again, there is some truth to the statements, but as always, they have been twisted to suit Putin's agenda. So yes, Russia does have a substantial rainy day fund, but no, they aren't a cure-all. Why? Well, for starters, at least $300 billion in foreign exchange reserves is frozen, thanks to a joint endeavor by allies like the US and Japan. Not only are the funds out of reach for Putin and Russia, but there have also been some talks of seizing these assets to finance the reconstruction of Ukraine. The rest of Russia's foreign exchange reserves are rapidly dwindling, losing dozens of billions of dollars since the onset of the conflict in Ukraine. The theory that Russia is gradually running out of money is also supported by the fact that the country has accumulated a massive budget deficit in 2022. To understand just how massive the deficit is, you should know that the Russian finance minister Anton Siluanov suggested using as much as one-third of the country's national wealth fund to pay for it. This fund, aka Russia's sovereign wealth fund, was worth almost $150 billion at the time. Interestingly, despite the suggestions of his finance minister, Putin actually claims that Russia is running a budget surplus, thanks to a series of dramatic fiscal projects and high energy prices. The dramatic projects in question include sweeping asset seizures, which are essentially turning Russia into a kleptocracy. While this might yield positive short-term results, it's setting the Russian economy on the road to ruin in the long run, and with it, Russia's hopes of ever reclaiming its spot at the top of the world economy. This, of course, means that the budget surplus is another myth propagated by the Kremlin. Any objective financial expert can see that Putin's reckless spending is unsustainable and will inevitably cause financial turmoil for the country. That is, if it hasn't already. This financial turmoil has expanded to almost every aspect of the Russian economy. The sectors heavily relying on international supply chains have it the worst, with some of them being hit by inflation up to 60%. In addition, the manufacturers in these sectors have to make do with what they can find in Russia, leading them to cannibalize and recycle parts of existing machines. This has gone so far that some reports suggest that the Russian military equipment found on the ground in Ukraine is filled with semiconductors from refrigerators and dishwashers. Even aircraft manufacturers resort to similar practices, despite cannibalized aircraft being inherently unsafe for operation. With this in mind, it shouldn't be surprising that the number of aircraft failures in Russia increased by 320% in 2023. Domestic spending isn't any better, despite the Kremlin labeling it as healthy. Unfortunately for Putin and Russia, there's nothing healthy about consumer spending and retail sales decreasing by 20% year over year. But leave it to Putin to find a way to spin almost any narrative. Even the exit of all major Western companies from Russia has been presented as a winning scenario for the country and its loyal elite. This has to do with Putin's stringent exit conditions and taxes, which caused these companies to declare over $100 billion in losses since the start of the war in Ukraine. But as much as Putin tries to paint a rosy picture, the truth is that major businesses pulling out of Russia can only be a bad thing. Even if the remaining domestic companies have a short-term boost in sales and revenue, they have no future without Western technology, as proven by the dramatic demise of the Russian aircraft industry. By now, it's apparent that a downward spiral is all you can see, regardless of which part of the Russian economy you scrutinize. But if you ask Putin, any dips resulting from international sanctions and businesses retreating from Russia are now over, allowing the country to recover steadily. Of course, this also couldn't be further from the truth. Even with all measures against Russia, the country continues to draw enough money to obscure its structural economic weaknesses and fund Putin's extravagant endeavors. This means that the sanctions against Russia are incomplete. The only way to ensure Russia can't bounce back from the current economic challenges is to introduce new financial and energy sanctions, which are already widely discussed among Ukraine's allies. Given that Russia is quite literally crumbling from the inside, these will only serve as the final nail in the coffin. But as well as the plan to freeze out Russia from global affairs is going, it's important to note that this fight has been nothing short of a Herculean endeavor. While the Western allies might score victory after victory, each comes at a cost. Regardless of how well the world economy bounces back, it's clear the war in Ukraine has irreversibly impacted numerous lives, altered trade flows, and transformed supply chains. Let's discuss this impact in more detail. There was lots of talk about alternative gas sources in this video, but there's one point we're yet to mention: the cost of those sources. There's no doubt about it, European businesses and individuals have experienced significantly higher gas prices since the onset of the Ukrainian conflict. These prices are arguably the only reason some experts believe a return to Russia's supplies might be inevitable. But this won't happen if Europe has any say. As soon as the gas prices spiked, the European government sprang into action, introducing various fiscal subsidies and transfer payments to ease the significant economic pressure on consumers. In other words, we find ourselves in a familiar situation. Russia tries to disrupt the world economy, but Western allies swiftly counteract. Plus, looking into how individual countries and industries have responded over time reveals that Russia's disruption is significantly less catastrophic than initially feared. Sure, the road to recovery might be long and bumpy, and the world economy might limp along instead of sprinting, but we can safely conclude that Russia will soon have no part in it. What do you think? Do you agree that Russia's energy and commodities have been weakened beyond repair? Or do you believe Putin is still in a position to disturb the global economy and its recovery? Share your opinions in the comments section below.